As you can see, we are about to rate every single scope in Rainbow Six Siege. First off, I want to start with the ACOGs. I think the ACOG A is probably technically the best ACOG in the game. Gonna give it a quick S tier. The scope doesn't actually take up much of your screen, the crosshair is not too invasive, and you still get a lot of glass scope. The only issue I don't like is the thick red dot in the center, but it's still a great scope and arguably the best ACOG in the entire game. And given how good ACOGs are, especially on defense, having this in S tier just makes absolute sense. The ACOG B as well, I think, deserves S tier. It's the best long-range ACOG that you could possibly bring. It's definitely a fan favorite, as I think using its crosshair is a little bit easier than using the ACOG A crosshair. However, it does take a lot of your peripherals, so sometimes your scope will actually cover people, which is not at all good. But it's what most people are used to, and therefore it is what most people run. And there's a reason that most people run it. It's a really good scope. So S tier for this one as well. But now let's go over the final ACOG, the first ACOG that isn't going to be S tier, and that is the ACOG C. I'm going to put this in A tier. It's still an ACOG, so I'm still going to give it at least an A rating. But there's just too much crosshair in this scope. There's an extra red ring that goes around the crosshair that doesn't need to be there. It's also very clunky. The shape of it is very weird. It's very blocky. But really, it has to do with the fact that there's too much crosshair in the middle going on, which is why I think it's a worse scope, but still a great scope overall, and an ACOG scope, which makes me want to put it again in A. But now that we've gone over the ACOGs, it's time to go over all of the 1x scopes in the game. Starting out with probably the worst, which is the Holo D. The Holo D is just terrible. You have a really blocky scope. You have almost zero glass space. The crosshair takes up the entire glass space, and there's no room in the middle of all three of the lines in the crosshair, making it to where you can't even see what you're looking at. So hitting heads with this thing or being able to see anything with this scope is near impossible, and it just looks terrible, which is why I had to put it in F tier. It's one of, if not the worst 1x scope in the entire game. Let's go over a scope that's at least a little bit better though, and that is the Red Dot A. The Red Dot A isn't terrible, it's just a worse version of the Red Dot C. It's very large, and the big wheel on the right takes up a large peripheral of your screen, but you do have the most glass space out of any red dot, making it not terrible, but just literally a worse version of the next scope that I'm going to talk about, which again is the Red Dot C. The Red Dot C I'm going to go ahead and put in A tier. It's a pretty skinny scope. You do have that big wheel off to the right, but I don't think it takes up nearly as much as the Red Dot A. You still have pretty much almost the exact same amount of glass space in this scope. The actual red dot itself is tiny as well, and because it's so thin, you get still a lot of peripheral space, and it feels nice to use on most weapons because of this. Definitely the best red dot in the entire game in my opinion, and very good for slow rate of fire guns for whatever reason. Now, we haven't really dabbled in the C tier at all, so I want to go over the first C tier scope, and that is going to be the Cybertruck Holo. The Cybertruck Holo is called the Cybertruck Holo because the scope looks like a Cybertruck. The only issue I think that most people have with this scope is because it's so blocky like a Cybertruck that it kind of just takes up your whole screen. That plus the two little lines that are next to the red dot in the middle are very blurry, especially if you have a lower end console or PC that you're playing the game with, which makes using this scope pretty hard to use for the average player. I will say I think it's a little overhated. It's definitely still usable on a lot of guns, especially compared to other scopes like the Holo D. I don't think it's an F tier scope as much as people want to meme on it, but definitely not one of the better scopes in the game for sure. Now that we've gone over a bunch of bad scopes though, I want to go over good scopes again. The first of which being the Holo A. The Holo A belongs in S tier with the two other ACOGs I put in here earlier. This is arguably the best and most consistent 1x scope in the entire game, even after its nerf of having a thick red dot in the center. It takes up almost no peripheral vision. The glass to crosshair to case ratio is nearly perfect, allowing you to get a lot of easy kills and to have visibility on whoever you're aiming at. Call it nostalgia, maybe you're right, but I think this scope is well deserving of the S tier. Another scope that I think is very, very good, the Reflex A, is going to go in the A tier. Probably the best reflex in the game. My only issue with reflexes in general is that the bullet comes out at the top of the crosshair instead of in the middle of the crosshair, but that's just a problem on my end, not really with every other player, so I don't want to really rate the scope based off of that. But I will say I do have one problem with this scope in particular, and that is that there is almost no glass space, meaning that what you're aimed in on with this scope, you can't really see much of. But because there's no glass space, that means that the casing is small, which means it is one of, if not the least invasive scope for how much of your peripherals that it blocks in the entire game. Very, very useful and nice to use on a lot of SMGs in the game, and arguably the best reflex in the game as well. Definitely a close runner-up in terms of good reflexes, though, would be the Reflex B, which will also go in A tier. You have more glass space and a crosshair that is just built for SMGs for some reason, although it does take up a little bit of your peripherals, and some people do find the crosshair a little bit too annoying compared to something simple like the Red Dot C or the Reflex A. This one's definitely dependent on the person who's using it, especially a lot more compared to other crosshairs. So if you want to rate this one lower or higher in your opinion, I completely understand. Something I will never understand though is anybody using the Reflex D on Tachanka's LMG. This scope sucks, and I'm going to put it in the F tier. I think it suffers from pretty much all the exact same issues as the Holo D. Little glass space, blocky crosshair, blocky casing in general that just makes the crosshair like unusable. I just do not recommend using this thing literally ever. There's no reason. There's so many better scopes you can put on it. I just hate this crosshair. Now, really quickly, before we go over anything else, I want to go over the sniper scopes in the game. First of all, you have Kali Sniper. I'm going to put this in C tier. I think it's just too zoomed in for most people. Like, unless you're really sitting outside of a breach or sitting in ruins of coastline the entire time, this is too zoomed in of a scope for most gunfights, which makes it to where you have to pull out your SMG to get kills. Not that that's a bad thing. Her SMG is great, but the fact that you have to pull out a different weapon to take close range gunfights because this one is so zoomed in just attests to the fact that it's way too zoomed in a scope. You also have no peripherals. There's a huge crosshair in your way. Just not a good scope overall, but when it does do its job and when you need it to actually work for how zoomed in it is pretty nice to use. Glaz's scope I'm going to put in B. I think it's just a more forgiving version of Kali's scope, and because dependent on what 1x scope you put on in front of the actual Glaz pop-up sniper, it can actually change what the scope looks like compared to Kali's crosshair, where it's just one stagnant crosshair, which makes this scope pretty much as good as you can get it for how zoomed in it is. So that's why I put it in B as opposed to C like the Kali Sniper. Now let's go over the scope that comes on Cade Pistol. Again, I'm just rating the scope here. I'm not rating the pistol included. I do think this is probably one of the worst pistols in the game because of its low ammo count, its high recoil, and the fact that it's so zoomed in for a pistol. But the scope itself, I honestly want to put in like A tier. It's really, really nice to use. If you can hit one taps with this pistol, being able to spawn peek with it is great. And you can still take short range engagements too if you're really kind of that guy with the scope. And the scope is a great scope to look at. It's very satisfying in my opinion, but maybe I'm just biased because I like to hit one taps. Another scope I'm slightly biased towards would be the Holo B. This originally came on the P10 Roni when Mozzie came out, but since then it's been added to everybody's gun. I think this is just a worse version of the Holo A. It's more blocky on the bottom and it has slightly more of a crosshair. I will say the crosshair is smaller, but that's not always a good thing. So I feel like Holo A is just going to be better, but this is still a good scope nonetheless. I think the Ella pistol scope that comes on Ella, Zofia, and Melusi is also something we need to talk about. In my opinion, this is an S tier scope. It takes up almost none of your screen, the red dot is very small, and the glass space you get is about as much as like a Reflex A, maybe even a little bit less, but it makes up for the fact that it has a very small crosshair, which makes this scope usable. Definitely a great scope in my opinion. Now let's go over the telescopic scopes. I do think these are really slept on, especially on like DMRs when you're on a really big map like Bank or Theme Park where there's a lot of long angles. These scopes are pretty good. Definitely not as good as an ACOG because you still have to take like close range gunfights, so I'll put them in B for now. At least this one, because the crosshair is pretty good, the casing doesn't take up too much of your screen, and you still have a lot of glass space. But this 3x scope, oh my god, this thing is horrid. Gotta probably put this one in like C tier. It takes up even more peripherals. It has a really, really invasive crosshair, and you actually get less glass space than you do on the other one. I could even make an argument for F, honestly, but it's a 3.5, so you can take long range gunfights, so I'll put it in C. Now we only have 2 scopes left on this list. We have the Red Dot B. The Red Dot B actually isn't that bad. I'll put it in B tier. My only issue is that the way that it fits on guns just makes the scope kind of awkward to use. And the fact that there's this big red circle around it just makes it a little invasive on the actual crosshair. You also don't get much glass space compared to something like the Red Dot C or the Red Dot A. So probably the worst red dot in the game in my opinion, maybe a little bit better than the Red Dot A, but I don't know, that's just personal preference at that point. Now for the final scope in the game, we're going to go over the Reflex C. I think this is a little bit overrated. The actual reticle in the middle is pretty big, and it takes the most amount of peripheral out of any other Reflex. Still a good scope, but in my opinion, this is a B tier scope, and something that you really shouldn't be running over the other reflexes in the game if those are more your speed. And that's it for this tier list. My name's Alka, check out this next video, and I hope we'll see you there.